It's the dead of night, when the world is asleep but something else stirs in the shadows, whether it's the silence of an empty hospital ward or the quiet of a forgotten lighthouse. Things are never quite as they seem after dark. Welcome to terrifying night shift tales that will leave you questioning what's real and what's waiting for you in the dark. But before we begin, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below about which story creeped you out the most. I always thought night shifts at the hospital were boring. Sure, there were the occasional emergencies, but most nights were quiet. Almost too quiet. Until that one night. The night I learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was my third week on the job as an overnight nurse in a small town hospital. The corridors were dimly lit, and the only sounds were the distant hum of machines and the occasional murmur from a patient's room. I was making my rounds when I noticed something odd. Room 207 had a light on. Room 207 was supposed to be empty. I froze for a moment, staring at the faint glow seeping from under the door. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was probably just a mistake. Maybe a maintenance worker had forgotten to turn it off. Still, I felt a strange pull, like I had to check. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. Inside, an elderly man sat upright in bed, staring at me. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the dim light. "Finally, someone," he said, his voice gravelly and weak. "Ah, sir, you're not supposed to be here," I stammered, trying to mask my unease. He gave a sad smile. "They put me here and forgot about me. I've been waiting so long." My stomach tightened. "Who put you here?" I asked, stepping closer. "The doctors, but they're gone now," he said, his gaze shifting toward the window. I followed his eyes, but all I saw was darkness outside. The air felt heavy, and I noticed the room was unnaturally cold. I nodded, forcing a calm tone. "Let me get your chart and check." I turned to leave, but then I heard him whisper, "You won't find it." Ignoring the warning, I hurried to the nurse's station and searched the records. There was no file for room 207. No admission for anyone matching his description. When I checked with the other staff, they insisted the room had been vacant for months. But when I returned to the room, it was empty. The bed was made, the light was off, and the cold air was gone. My pulse thundered as I scanned the room, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, are you still here?" And then I saw it. A single handprint on the window, frost-covered and impossibly large, like it didn't belong to a human. The rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound felt magnified. By morning, I was certain I'd imagined it, a trick of exhaustion. But when I told one of the older nurses about it, her face went pale. "You saw him," she said quietly. "Saw who?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Room 207's patient. He's been dead for 10 years. But sometimes he comes back, looking for someone to remember him." I quit the job the next day. But even now, I can't sleep in a dark room, and sometimes I still feel his eyes on me, watching me. If I had known the lighthouse job came with a secret, I never would have taken it. But back then, I was desperate for work. And it seemed simple enough. Keep the light going, record the weather, and stay out of trouble. Easy, right? At least until I found the journal. The lighthouse stood on a jagged cliff overlooking a restless sea. It had been abandoned for years, and the locals didn't seem too eager to talk about why. "It's old," they'd say, or "dangerous in storms." I didn't push. The pay was decent, and I figured isolation was what I needed to sort my life out. The first week was uneventful. The wind howled outside, and the waves slammed against the rocks below, but inside it was quiet, peaceful. Then, one stormy night, I found it. A leather-bound journal tucked behind a loose panel in the storage room. It wasn't part of the lighthouse's official records. The cover was cracked, and the pages were brittle with age. The first entry was dated 1903. At first it seemed harmless. Notes about the weather, routine maintenance, the loneliness of the job. But as I read on, the entries grew darker. August 15th. Heard it again. The knocking came from the trap door under the lantern room. Checked it, nothing there. But it's getting louder. I frowned, flipping the pages. The entries became more frantic. August 18th. Can't sleep. The knocking's worse. Now it's followed by whispers. Low, guttural whispers. They say my name. August 20th. The door won't stay shut. I nailed it down, but something's trying to get out. My chest tightened as I realized the trap door was directly above me, leading to the lantern room. I put the journal down and tried to laugh it off. Just an old keeper scaring himself in the isolation, I thought. But when I climbed to the lantern room to check, my blood ran cold. The trap door was scratched, deep grooves, like something had clawed at it from below. That night, the storm hit its peak. The wind roared, and the lighthouse groaned with each gust. I was about to go to bed when I heard it. A knock, faint but deliberate. It came again, 3 slow knocks, coming from above. I froze, staring up at the ceiling. The sound shouldn't have been possible. The trapdoor led to nothing but the lantern housing. My heart pounded as the knocking turned into scraping, like nails dragging across the wood. Then came the whisper. "Let me out." I bolted to the door, but before I could leave, the light in the lantern room flickered. I don't know why I looked back, but I did. The trapdoor was open, just a crack, and something was watching me. 2 pinpricks of light, eyes that glowed like the beam of the lighthouse itself. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the village. When I tried to explain, no one believed me. "Old lighthouses make strange noises," they said. "You just spooked yourself." But as I packed to leave, the clerk at the supply store pulled me aside. "You're not the first to run," she whispered. "The last keeper left in the middle of the night, too. Said the same thing. Something under the trap door. I never went back. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear the whisper. Let me out." I should have trusted my gut that night. Something about the cabin in the woods didn't feel right. But the storm was too strong to turn back, and my car wasn't going anywhere. So I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the porch, hoping for a place to wait it out. That's when I saw the axe. It was lodged in a tree stump near the steps, its blade clean and sharp despite the rusted handle. The cabin looked abandoned. The windows were dark, and the wood was gray with age. But as I approached, the door creaked open slightly, as if someone had been expecting me. "Hello," I called out, stepping inside. My voice echoed in the empty room. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs clung to the corners. But there was something off about the place. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The fireplace was cold, but a stack of wood sat neatly beside it, and the table in the center of the room was set for one. A plate, a cup, and a fork and knife arranged perfectly. My flashlight beam landed on an old photograph hanging on the wall. It showed a man with a long beard, standing beside the same axe I'd seen outside. His expression was blank, but his eyes, they seemed to follow me. I tried to shake off the unease and lit a fire to warm up. As the flames crackled, I noticed something strange. There were no animal sounds outside. No wind through the trees, no distant howls, nothing, just silence. Then came the knocking. It was slow and deliberate, like someone was tapping on the window in the next room. My breath caught as I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the glass was clear. No one was there. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch in the wind, but the knocking moved. First to the front door, then to the wall behind me. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. And then it stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, when I noticed something new. The axe, it wasn't in the stump anymore. Panic set in as I scanned the room. That's when I saw the footprints. Wet, muddy prints leading from the door to the photograph. The man in the picture, his face had changed. His blank expression was now a twisted grin, his eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. I grabbed my bag and ran, stumbling through the storm until I found the road. When I finally reached the highway, a passing truck stopped to help. The driver was an older man, and when I told him about the cabin, his face turned pale. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "That's old Joe's cabin. They say he went mad one winter, killed everyone who came near. No one's lived there in decades, but some folks claim he never really left. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. But every now and then when I drive past those woods, I catch a glimpse of something in the trees. A figure with an axe, just watching." The train was late again. It was past midnight, and I stood on the platform, shivering as the cold seeped into my bones. The schedule board flickered, showing delays for every line, and the few passengers around me looked just as tired and frustrated as I felt. I hated working the late shift, but I hated waiting even more. That's when I noticed the train. It wasn't on the board. No announcement came through the crackling speakers. But there it was, gliding into the station silently, like a ghost. The carriages were old, the kind you'd see in black and white photos with ornate brass railings and wooden doors. I hesitated, glancing at the other commuters, but no one else seemed to notice it. They stood motionless, their faces blank, as if frozen in time. A man in a dark uniform stepped off the train, his cap pulled low over his face. He didn't speak, just raised a gloved hand and gestured for me to board. Something in me screamed to run, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the open door. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. It smelled of damp wood and something metallic, like old blood. The interior was dimly lit by flickering gas lamps casting long, eerie shadows. The seats were empty, yet I felt watched, as if dozens of unseen eyes were tracking my every move. I sat down near the window, clutching my bag tightly. The train lurched forward, and the station vanished into the darkness. Outside, there was nothing but fog, thick and impenetrable, swirling like it was alive. The train moved faster than it should have, the wheels screeching on the tracks, but no one came to check my ticket. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. Then, the lights flickered again, and I saw them. Figures in the fog, shadowy and distorted, running alongside the train. Their limbs moved unnaturally, too long and too fast. One pressed its face against the window, grinning with teeth that didn't belong in any human mouth. I jerked back, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The train slowed, and a voice crackled over the intercom, garbled and deep, like it came from underwater. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they weren't meant for me. The train stopped at another platform, identical to the one I'd left, but the signs were wrong. The letters twisted and unreadable. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag and bolted off the train, my breath clouding in the icy air. The conductor tipped his hat as I passed, but I avoided his gaze, terrified of what I might see beneath the brim. The platform was empty, and the train disappeared into the fog as quickly as it had come. I stumbled toward the exit, relieved to find the city streets beyond. But something was different. The buildings were there, but they were darker, older. And the air felt heavy, like I'd stepped into a place that shouldn't exist. When I finally got home, my clock read 5 a.m. I'd been gone for hours, but my phone still showed the same date. Exhausted, I collapsed into bed, hoping to forget. The next morning, I tried to retrace my steps, but the station was gone. There was nothing but an empty lot where it should have been, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken glass. A man walking by stopped when he saw me staring. "Looking for the old station?" he asked. "They tore that down 50 years ago. Funny. People still say they see trains there sometimes. Trains that never should have existed." I never rode the late train again, but some nights when I hear the distant screech of wheels on the tracks, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for its next passenger. Driving alone at night was something I usually enjoyed. The solitude, the open road, and the stars above always felt calming. But that stretch of highway past mile marker 13, I'll never take it again. Not after what I saw. It was supposed to be a quick trip. 2 hours to the next town, drop off some paperwork, and head back before dawn. The highway was deserted, my headlights cutting through the inky darkness. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I first noticed the mile markers around midnight. They were spaced like any other markers, small reflective signs that ticked off the distance. But as I approached mile marker 13, my radio crackled. Static hissed through the speakers, and then I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted. "Help me." I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. The road ahead was empty, and the voice was gone as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was just interference, maybe picking up a stray frequency, and kept driving. But a mile later, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure stood on the side of the road, barely illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long arms that dangled at its sides. Its head tilted slightly, as though it were watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I gripped the wheel tighter, speeding up. The markers kept flashing by, 14, 15, 16. But the air felt heavier, the darkness thicker. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. The figure was ahead of me now, standing in the middle of the road. It didn't move as I approached, and my stomach dropped as I saw it up close. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a swirling void, blacker than the night around it. My headlights seemed to sink into it, swallowed whole. I swerved, narrowly avoiding it, and pulled over a mile later, shaking and gasping for breath. When I looked back, the road was empty. No figure, no movement, nothing but silence. I wanted to turn around to take another route, but something caught my eye. The marker beside my car wasn't 17. It wasn't even 16. It was 13 again, the same marker I'd passed 10 minutes ago. Panic clawed at me as I sped down the highway, but no matter how far I drove, every sign read the same. Mile marker 13. The trees seemed to twist and stretch, their branches reaching toward the car like skeletal hands. My phone had no signal, and the dashboard clock flickered erratically, jumping between minutes and hours. Then the voice returned. "Help me." It whispered, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "Help me, please." Desperate, I yelled into the darkness. "What do you want?" The static on the radio grew louder, and the voice replied, clearer this time. "You're where I was, where I'll always be." A shadow swept across the car, and my headlights dimmed as though the darkness outside was pressing in. I closed my eyes, gripping the wheel, and kept driving. When I finally opened them, the signs had changed. Mile marker 14. Then 15. I was free. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, my hands still trembling as I pulled into a gas station. The attendant looked at me strangely as I stumbled inside, babbling about the road and the shadow. "You must have been on the old highway," he said, shaking his head. "Locals don't take it after dark. They say a man died at mile marker 13 years ago. An accident no one could explain. Some say he's still out there, looking for someone to take his place. I've never driven that road again, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that shadow and wonder, did I really escape, or am I just waiting my turn?" They say you can't get lost in a town you grew up in, but that night, the streets seemed different. Familiar but wrong, like a song played slightly out of tune. I'd taken a wrong turn after leaving a friend's house, and somehow I ended up in a neighborhood I didn't recognize. The houses were old, their windows dark, and the trees lining the road cast jagged shadows under the pale moonlight. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A house at the end of the street, glowing faintly as though it were lit from within. It was larger than the others, with ivy crawling up its stone walls and a wrought iron gate standing wide open. Something about it drew me in, like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. I pulled over and got out, telling myself I was just curious. Maybe someone could give me directions. But as I walked up the overgrown path, I noticed there were no cars, no lights in the windows, just that faint, unearthly glow that seemed to come from the house itself. The door creaked open before I even knocked. "Hello," I called out, stepping inside. The air was thick and musty, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet. The entryway was vast, with a grand staircase that spiraled into the darkness above. Portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following me as I moved. I was about to leave when I heard it, the sound of footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. My skin prickled as I stared up the staircase, half expecting someone to appear. But no one did. "Hello," I tried again, louder this time. The footsteps stopped. And then, laughter. Soft, childlike, but wrong. It echoed through the house, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I turned to leave, but the door I'd entered through was gone. In its place was a blank wall. Panic set in as I searched for another way out. The laughter grew louder, mingling with whispers I couldn't understand. The portraits on the wall seemed to shift, their expressions warping into twisted grins. I stumbled into a parlor, where a fireplace roared to life the moment I entered. Above the mantel was a mirror, but the reflection wasn't mine. It was the house. The same room I was standing in, but in the mirror, it was full of people. They stood silently, staring at me, their faces pale and blurred like old photographs. One of them raised a hand and pointed toward a door behind me. I turned, trembling, and saw the door they indicated. It was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. The whispers grew louder, urging me forward, and I felt my feet move against my will. The door led to a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in as I walked. At the end of the hall was another door. A brass plaque on it read, "Welcome home." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Behind me, the laughter and whispers surged, filling the hallway with a deafening roar. With no other choice, I opened the door, and I was outside. The house was gone, replaced by an empty lot surrounded by crumbling trees. My car sat where I'd left it, the engine still running. I stumbled toward it, gasping for air, and drove straight home without looking back. The next day, I tried to find the street again, but it wasn't there. No one I asked had ever heard of a neighborhood like the one I described. But sometimes late at night, I'll see it in my dreams, that glowing house, waiting for me. And I know one thing for sure. It wasn't me who found the house. It was the house that found me. It was supposed to be a quiet night. Just me, a thermos of coffee, and an endless stretch of empty road as I drove back to the city after visiting my parents. The detour through farmland was a mistake. A shortcut that turned into an eerie, winding path flanked by towering rows of corn. The stalks swayed in the faint breeze, their rustling the only sound in the oppressive silence. Then I saw the scarecrow. It stood just off the road, near the edge of the field, slumped and crooked. Its head was an old burlap sack, and its body was patched together with faded cloth and hay. Something about it made me slow down. Its arms hung too long, almost brushing the ground, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was watching me. I shook off the unease and kept driving, but the feeling lingered. That scarecrow wasn't like the ones I'd seen before. It felt wrong, alive almost. A few miles later, my headlights caught another one, identical to the first. Same slouched posture, same tattered clothes. I frowned. Had I gotten turned around? Was I driving in circles? The GPS on my phone was useless. No signal in the middle of nowhere. I kept going, gripping the wheel tightly, but the road felt endless. The same rows of corn, the same pale moonlight, the same silence. And then, another scarecrow. This one was closer to the road, its head slightly lifted, as if it were looking at me. My stomach churned. It wasn't possible. I hadn't turned around. I was sure of it. I pulled over, stepping out of the car with my flashlight. The night was unnervingly still, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decaying leaves. I shined the beam toward the scarecrow, half expecting it to move. It didn't, but something in the field did. A shadow, brief and flickering, darting between the stalks. "Hello." My voice sounded too loud, breaking the silence. I took a step closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadow appeared again, this time closer, and my pulse quickened. It wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human. The rustling grew louder, and suddenly all the corn seemed to sway, though there was no wind. I backed toward the car, my heart hammering, when I heard it, a low, guttural laugh, echoing from deep within the field. I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door, fumbling to start the engine. The headlights flared to life, and my breath caught. The scarecrow was gone. The post it had been tied to stood empty, swaying slightly. I floored the gas, the tires screeching as I sped down the road. The corn blurred past, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Then, just as I thought I'd left it behind, something stepped into the road ahead. It wasn't a scarecrow. It was a man. Or something shaped like one. His head was covered by a burlap sack, but beneath the fabric I could see movement, like insects crawling just under the surface. His arms dangled unnaturally, joints bending the wrong way, and his body swayed as if held up by invisible strings. I swerved, narrowly missing him, and kept driving without looking back. The road eventually led me to a gas station, where I stumbled inside, pale and shaking. The attendant looked up from his newspaper and frowned. "You all right, kid?" he asked. I blurted out everything. The scarecrows, the shadows, the man in the road. His face darkened as I spoke, and he shook his head slowly. "You took the old farm road, didn't you?" he said. "That place, it's cursed. Been abandoned for decades. People say the scarecrows there, they're not just decorations, they're guardians, or prisoners." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And whatever's in that field, it doesn't like being watched." I didn't sleep that night, and I've avoided back roads ever since. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I swear I see it again. A shadow in the distance, standing too still, with arms too long, waiting.